Something unusual just happened inside a federal courtroom. It wasn't a dramatic speech, it wasn't a surprise witness, and it wasn't a final ruling. Instead, a federal judge made a procedural move that has suddenly placed the Department of Justice under even closer judicial scrutiny. And legal observers say it could shape what happens next in one of Washington's most closely watched transparency disputes. At the center of the case is a battle over records connected to Jeffrey Epstein, questions about whether the government fully complied with court orders, and a judge who has decided to personally examine disputed evidence rather than simply accept written explanations. For Donald Trump, the case adds another layer to an already crowded legal landscape, not because the judge has ruled against him, but because every new court order keeps public attention focused on a dispute that continues to generate political and legal debate. And what the judge does next could become the biggest development yet. Welcome back. In politics, headlines often focus on campaign speeches, polls, and breaking statements. But some of the most important developments happen far away from television cameras, inside federal courtrooms, where judges make decisions based on evidence, legal standards, and procedural rules. That's exactly what's unfolding now. The lawsuit centers on requests for greater transparency involving government records connected to Jeffrey Epstein. Journalist Katie Pang challenged the Department of Justice over whether additional documents should be disclosed, arguing that the public has a right to access certain records. In response, Judge Emmett Sullivan ordered the government to produce specific materials for his own private review, known as an in-camera inspection, rather than relying only on written arguments from either side. That step is significant. When a federal judge asks to personally inspect disputed documents, it signals that the court wants to independently evaluate whether the government's legal justifications are sufficient. According to the source material, the Department of Justice submitted the requested records before the court's deadline, allowing Judge Sullivan to begin that review. But those documents are only one part of the story. Separate questions remain about whether the government fully complied with earlier court directives, including issues involving untranslated foreign language documents and documentation explaining extensive redactions. Those broader compliance questions are still pending before the court. That's why legal analysts are watching this case so closely. The next written order won't just address a few disputed records. It could clarify how federal courts expect government agencies to balance transparency, privacy, and compliance with judicial orders. At first glance, this may sound like just another procedural order, but in federal court, procedural decisions often become the turning points that shape an entire case. So, why are legal experts paying such close attention to Judge Sullivan's latest move? The answer lies in one simple principle. A judge doesn't have to accept either side's explanation at face value. Instead, the court can demand the underlying evidence and evaluate it independently. That's exactly what happened here. Rather than relying solely on written arguments from the Department of Justice, Judge Sullivan ordered several disputed documents to be delivered directly to his chambers for an in-camera review, meaning he would examine them privately before deciding whether the government's explanations justified keeping portions of those records from public release. That may seem like a technical legal step, but in reality, it's one of the strongest tools federal judges have when disputes arise over sensitive records. It allows the court to separate legal arguments from the documents themselves. According to the filings discussed in the source material, the Department of Justice met the court's deadline by providing the requested materials, allowing Judge Sullivan to begin his review. So what exactly is the judge reviewing? The disputed records reportedly include emails and investigative materials that the government argues involve individuals it identifies as victims or potential victims. Because of those privacy concerns, the DOJ has argued that certain names and identifying information should remain protected from public disclosure. That creates an important legal balancing act. On one side is the public's interest in government transparency. On the other is the court's responsibility to protect victims from unnecessary harm. Neither principle automatically outweighs the other. That's why judges often examine the evidence personally before making a final decision. But here's where the case becomes even more interesting. The documents sitting on Judge Sullivan's desk represent only one part of a much larger dispute. Because beyond those specific records, another set of questions remains unresolved, and those issues could prove just as significant. While everyone focuses on the documents the judge is reviewing, another battle has been unfolding behind the scenes, and according to many legal observers, this second issue could ultimately become even more important than the first. The dispute centers on whether the Department of Justice fully complied with earlier court directives. One issue involves thousands of pages of foreign language materials connected to the broader Epstein investigation. Critics argue those documents should have been translated before decisions were made about withholding or releasing them, while the government has taken a different position regarding its review process. A second issue involves documentation explaining why certain records were withheld or heavily redacted. In federal litigation, courts often expect parties to provide detailed explanations, so judges can evaluate whether those redactions are legally justified. Those compliance questions remain pending and have not yet been resolved by Judge Sullivan. Why does that matter? Because federal judges don't simply decide whether documents should be released, they also examine how government agencies reached those decisions. Did officials follow the required procedures? Were court orders fully carried out? Were deadlines met? Were explanations legally sufficient? Those procedural questions can become just as important as the records themselves. At this stage, it's important to distinguish between what has happened and what some commentators predict could happen next. The court has not issued a contempt ruling. Instead, Judge Sullivan is continuing to review the submitted materials and the broader compliance issues before deciding what additional action, if any, is appropriate. Meanwhile, another filing added an entirely different dimension to the case. A woman identified in court only as Jane Doe asked to intervene, requesting that her identity remain protected. According to her filing, releasing her name would provide little additional public understanding of the government's conduct while exposing her to significant personal harm. She also argued that certain communications could appear misleading if viewed without the context of the abuse she says she suffered. That filing highlights why this case has become so legally complex. It's no longer just about document disclosure. It's about balancing transparency, privacy, victim protection, and the government's legal obligations all at the same time. At this point, the case is no longer just about whether certain documents should remain confidential. It's becoming a broader test of how a federal court evaluates the Department of Justice's handling of sensitive records. And that's why the judge's next move is drawing so much attention. Here's what makes this stage different. Normally, when government lawyers argue that documents should remain sealed or partially redacted, they explain their reasoning through written filings. But Judge Sullivan decided that wasn't enough. Instead of relying only on those explanations, he chose to personally review the disputed records before deciding whether the government's position is legally justified. That independent review gives the court several possible paths forward. The judge could conclude that the Department of Justice acted appropriately and that the existing redactions should remain. He could determine that additional portions of the records should be released while still protecting victim identities. Or he could decide that further briefing is necessary before making a final ruling. At this stage, all of those possibilities remain open. No final decision has been announced. And that's an important point. Much of the public conversation surrounding this case has focused on predictions. Legal commentators have discussed what they believe the judge might do, but predictions are not court orders. The only outcome that matters is the one contained in Judge Sullivan's eventual written ruling. Meanwhile, another filing reminded everyone that this litigation involves real people, not just legal arguments. A woman identified only as Jane Doe asked the court to keep her identity protected. Her attorneys argued that revealing her name would do little to improve public understanding of the government's actions while exposing her to renewed personal harm. According to the filing, communications viewed without context could unfairly suggest that she willingly participated in conduct when she instead describes herself as a victim of Jeffrey Epstein's abuse. That filing illustrates one of the most difficult responsibilities federal judges face. Transparency is essential, but so is protecting victims whose identities could be unnecessarily exposed. Judge Sullivan must now balance both principles at the same time, and that's precisely why this case has attracted national attention. It's not simply a dispute over documents, it's a legal test of how courts supervise government transparency while protecting legitimate privacy interests. As Washington waits for the next written order, lawyers on both sides understand that every sentence of the judge's opinion could shape not only this lawsuit, but future disputes involving sensitive government records as well. As Judge Sullivan continues reviewing the evidence before him, one thing has become increasingly clear. This case is no longer just about a handful of disputed documents. It's becoming a broader examination of how the Department of Justice responds when a federal court demands greater transparency while balancing the privacy rights of victims. That is why attorneys, journalists, and legal analysts across Washington are watching every filing so closely, because whatever happens next could influence how similar disputes are handled in the future. The bigger picture federal courts play a unique role in the American legal system. They don't decide cases based on political pressure. They decide them based on evidence, legal standards, and whether government agencies have complied with the law. That's why Judge Sullivan's review is so important. Instead of accepting either side's arguments at face value, he's personally examining the disputed records before determining whether the government's decisions were justified. That independent review is designed to strengthen public confidence in the judicial process. It demonstrates that when disagreements arise over transparency, the court, not political commentators or government officials, has the final say. What happens next? Several outcomes remain possible. The judge could conclude that the Department of Justice properly applied the law and allow the current redactions to remain. He could determine that some records should be released with additional information made public while still protecting victim identities. Or he could decide that further explanations or additional compliance measures are necessary before the case can move forward. At this stage, no final ruling has been issued, and the court has not announced whether any sanctions or contempt findings will occur. Those remain matters for the judge's future decision, not established facts. That distinction matters because court proceedings often unfold in stages. One order leads to another, one filing raises new questions, and judges frequently take time to ensure the record is complete before issuing decisions that may have lasting legal consequences. Why everyone is watching cases involving government transparency often attract attention because they touch on two competing values. The first is the public's interest in understanding how government agencies make decisions. The second is the responsibility to protect victims and other individuals whose privacy rights may be affected by disclosure. Judge Sullivan now finds himself balancing both responsibilities simultaneously. The filing submitted on behalf of Jane Doe highlights exactly why that balance can be so difficult. According to her attorneys, releasing her identity would add little to the public's understanding of the government's conduct while exposing her to significant personal harm. That illustrates why federal judges rarely treat transparency as an all-or-nothing issue. Instead, they often evaluate documents indi. So where does this case stand today? Judge Sullivan now has the disputed materials before him. The Department of Justice has submitted the records the court requested. Questions about broader compliance remain under review, and the court is still weighing how to balance transparency with the protection of alleged victims. For Donald Trump, the continued legal attention surrounding matters connected to the broader Epstein records litigation means another closely watched court proceeding unfolding alongside his other legal and political challenges. But regardless of politics, the next major development will come from the court itself, not from speculation, not from social media, and not from headlines. It will come when Judge Sullivan issues his next written order explaining how he believes the law applies to the facts before him. That decision will likely become the most important chapter in this case so far. If you found this breakdown helpful, let us know your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the judge will determine the Department of Justice has fully complied with the court's directives, or do you expect additional proceedings before a final resolution? If you enjoyed this in-depth legal analysis, don't forget to subscribe for more fact-based coverage of the biggest political and courtroom stories shaping Washington. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.